What would you do if years after walking away from someone you once loved, you discovered they had been raising your child without you ever knowing? Not because they hated you, not because they wanted revenge, but because they didn't believe your world had space for them anymore. Think about that for a second. Have you ever walked away from something, convinced it was over, only to feel later that something was left unfinished? Have you ever trusted silence, accepted it, only to find out it was hiding something much bigger than you imagined? Because this story sits right in that uncomfortable space between what we think we understand and what we never saw coming, between control and freedom, between love and the consequences of not knowing how to hold on to it. And before we go any further, listen carefully. If you've ever been in a relationship that ended without closure, if you've ever wondered what if you've ever lost time you can never get back, then you need to stay until the very end of this story, because this one isn't just about love. It's about time. It's about choices. And it's about a truth that should have never been hidden. So do me a favor right now. Before we go deeper, hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me honestly, what would you do if you found out you had a child years after they were born? And if you're new here, subscribe, because stories like this don't come around often. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. The room was filled with voices, laughter, and the low hum of people trying to impress each other. Crystal glasses clinked, conversations overlapped, soft music floated in the background, just loud enough to fill silence, not loud enough to demand attention. It was the kind of event Mark had attended hundreds of times. Polished, predictable, carefully controlled. He stood near the edge of the room, one hand resting lightly against a glass he hadn't touched in several minutes. His posture was straight, his expression calm, his presence commanding without effort. People noticed him. They always did, not just because of his wealth, but because of the way he carried himself. Measured, observant, distant. He didn't rush conversations. He didn't chase attention. He simply stood and let the room come to him. But tonight, something felt different, not wrong, just off. It started small, the kind of feeling most people would ignore. But Mark didn't ignore details. That was part of who he was. His eyes moved across the room, scanning faces, reading movements, catching patterns without thinking about it. And that's when he saw the child. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. Children were sometimes brought to these events, usually by people who wanted to appear grounded, relatable, human. But this child wasn't running around, wasn't chasing attention, wasn't clinging to an adult. The child stood slightly apart from the crowd, still, quiet, watching, not with curiosity, but with intention. Mark's gaze lingered a second longer than necessary, then another, because something about the way the child observed the room felt familiar, not obvious, not immediate, but enough to make him pause. The child wasn't distracted by noise, wasn't reacting to movement. Instead, their eyes moved deliberately, taking in details, studying people, noticing things others ignored, the same way Mark did, the same way he had always done. He shifted slightly, adjusting his stance without realizing it, and almost instantly, the child mirrored the movement. Not perfectly, not exaggerated, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. And Mark was. His expression didn't change, but something inside him tightened, because this wasn't coincidence, not the way most people would define it. This was pattern, behavior, instinct. The kind that doesn't come from imitation, the kind that comes from something deeper. He watched a little longer. The child tilted their head slightly, focusing on a conversation across the room, not listening, analyzing. Mark felt it again, that quiet recognition, the kind that doesn't ask permission before it settles in your chest. And then the child looked in his direction, not directly at him, but close enough for Mark to see something in their expression that made his grip tighten slightly around the glass. Calm, controlled, aware, too aware. For a child, a slow, almost invisible breath left his chest, because now it wasn't just familiarity, it was discomfort, the kind that comes when something starts to make sense before you're ready for it to. He didn't move closer, didn't speak, didn't interrupt the moment. He just watched, trying to understand why something so small felt so significant. And then everything shifted, because the child wasn't alone. Not really. They turned slightly, and someone stepped into view. Maria. Time didn't slow down. It didn't stop. It didn't do anything dramatic. But for Mark, everything else faded. The room, the noise, the conversations. None of it mattered anymore, because standing there, calm, composed, unshaken, was Maria. She looked almost the same, but not exactly. There was something different in the way she carried herself. Not lighter, not heavier, just certain. Like someone who had already made peace with something long before this moment. Mark didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe properly for a second, because his mind wasn't trying to catch up. It was already there, already connecting pieces, already forming a conclusion he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. Maria's eyes met his, and that's when it became real, because she didn't look surprised. She didn't look uncomfortable. She didn't look like someone caught off guard. She looked prepared, calm in a way that didn't ask questions, calm in a way that already knew the answers. And in that moment, Mark understood something without a single word being spoken. She knew, not just about seeing him here, not just about this moment, but about something bigger, something that had existed long before tonight. His gaze shifted, just slightly, back toward the child, then back to her. And that's when the realization settled in. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with weight, the kind that doesn't need confirmation to feel real. She knew. The thought didn't finish out loud. It didn't need to, because the rest of it landed on its own. And she didn't tell me. If you're still here right now, I want you to pause and think, what does that feel like? Not anger. Not yet. Just realization. The kind that hits before emotion has time to catch up. The kind that makes everything else feel distant for a moment. Because suddenly, the past isn't where you left it, and the present isn't what you thought it was. And whatever comes next is going to change everything. So stay with me, because this moment, this exact moment right here, it didn't start tonight. It started years ago, in a place where none of this made sense, where two completely different worlds collided and somehow believed they could survive each other. The moment didn't break. It stretched. Mark stood there, still facing Maria, still aware of the child just a few steps away. But something inside him had already shifted direction, not outward, inward, because whatever this was, whatever truth had just brushed against his awareness, it didn't belong to the present. It came from somewhere earlier, somewhere unfinished. And without moving, without speaking, without even fully deciding to, his mind went back. Years earlier, Texas, where differences weren't just noticed, they were discussed, measured, judged, and remembered. Mark had built his life in a way that minimized questions, not because he feared them, but because he didn't have time for them. At 38, he wasn't just wealthy, he was influential, the kind of man whose decisions shaped outcomes far beyond his immediate circle. Oil investments that shifted local economies, tech expansions that opened doors and closed others, land acquisitions that changed the direction of entire communities. His name carried weight, not just in business rooms, but in conversations he wasn't even part of. And because of that, his life had structure. Everything had purpose. Meetings were scheduled down to the minute. Conversations had direction. Relationships had boundaries. Even his downtime was controlled, not rigid in a way that looked forced, but precise in a way that left very little room for unpredictability. That was how he functioned. That was how he succeeded. That was how he stayed ahead. Maria's life didn't follow any of those rules. At 2009, she lived in a world that didn't ask permission to be loud or warm or connected. Her days weren't structured around outcomes. They were built around people. Family that didn't always need explanation. Neighbors who showed up without invitation. Conversations that stretched longer than planned. Music that filled spaces without asking if it should. She didn't organize her life around control. She moved with it, adjusted when needed, held on to what mattered, let go of what didn't, and most importantly, she saw people, not their titles, not their status, not what they could offer, just who they were. These two worlds were never meant to blend easily. They operated on different principles, different expectations, different definitions of what mattered. And yet, they met. It wasn't planned, not on his side. Mark had only attended the community fundraising event because his assistant insisted. It's good visibility, she had told him earlier that week. People like to see you outside of business environments. He hadn't argued, because it made sense, not personally, but strategically. So he went, dressed appropriately, arrived on time, prepared to stay long enough to be seen, and then leave. The venue was nothing like the events he usually attended. There was no strict seating arrangement, no quiet conversations behind controlled smiles, no carefully measured networking. Instead, there was movement, energy, voices layered over each other, people greeting each other with familiarity that didn't need introduction. It wasn't chaotic, but it wasn't controlled either, and Mark noticed immediately. He stood near one side of the space, observing more than participating, holding a drink he hadn't touched, listening just enough to respond when spoken to, but not seeking conversation, because this wasn't his environment, and he didn't pretend it was. Maria was everywhere, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made things function. She moved from one side of the event to the other with purpose, adjusting details, answering questions, redirecting small problems before they became bigger ones, talking, laughing, connecting, without stopping, without forcing anything. It came naturally to her. At one point, she turned quickly, focused on something behind her, and walked straight into Mark. The contact wasn't heavy, but it was enough to interrupt both of them. Mark stepped back slightly, more out of instinct than reaction. Maria looked up. No hesitation, no apology rushed out of nervousness, just awareness. Then, a small shift in her expression, not embarrassment, recognition of something. Wow, she said, looking him over briefly, then meeting his eyes again. You look like you got lost on your way to a board meeting. Mark blinked once, not because he didn't understand what she said, but because of how she said it. Direct, unfiltered, completely comfortable. No adjustment, no caution. Excuse me, he replied, his tone neutral, but slightly sharper than before. She tilted her head just slightly, not challenging, not apologizing either. Relax, she said. I'm joking. A brief pause. Mostly. For a second, Mark considered ending the interaction right there. That would have been the normal response. A polite nod, a brief acknowledgement, and then distance, because that's how he handled unexpected interactions, especially ones that didn't follow structure. But he didn't walk away. Instead, he asked, "Do I look that out of place?" Maria didn't answer immediately. She looked at him again, not quickly, not casually, but intentionally, as if she was actually considering the question. "Yes," she said. No hesitation, no softening, just honesty. And something about that answer didn't push him away. It held him there. Interesting, Mark said quietly. Maria smiled slightly, not because she was trying to charm him, but because she found the moment genuine. You're not used to hearing that, are you? No, he said. And that answer was just as honest. There was a pause, not awkward, not forced, just real. Around them, the event continued. Voices, movement, music. But for a brief moment, none of it mattered, because two completely different worlds had just crossed paths, without preparation, without adjustment, without expectation, and neither of them walked away. Before we go further, I want you to think about this. Have you ever met someone who completely disrupted your world, not because they tried to impress you, but because they refused to adjust to you? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear it. That moment, simple as it seemed, didn't stay simple, because some interactions don't end where they begin. They build, they linger, they shift something. And for Mark, that was the moment everything started to change. That moment didn't end when the conversation paused. It stayed, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made both of them aware. Mark didn't usually stay longer than necessary at events like this. He showed up, made his presence known, left. That was his pattern. Efficient, controlled, predictable. But that night, he stayed, not because of the event, because of her. Maria moved on after their first interaction, not dismissively, just naturally. There were things to handle, people to speak with, details to manage. She didn't linger, didn't try to extend the moment, and that alone was different. Because most people, once they recognized who Mark was, adjusted. Their tone changed. Their posture shifted. Their words became careful. Maria didn't do any of that. Mark noticed, and without fully deciding to, he found himself watching her again. She laughed easily, spoke freely, moved through the space like she belonged there, in a way that didn't need validation. There was no performance, no effort to impress, no awareness of hierarchy. And that absence was what drew his attention. He approached her again, not immediately, not impulsively, but deliberately. "You didn't ask who I was," Mark said when he reached her. Maria glanced at him, then returned her focus to adjusting something on a nearby table. "I didn't need to," she replied. Mark studied her for a moment. "Most people do." She shrugged lightly. "Most people care about things that don't matter to me." That answer should have ended the conversation. It didn't. "And what does matter to you?" he asked. This time she looked at him fully, not casually, not briefly, but directly. "People," she said. The word landed simply, but it carried weight. Mark nodded once, as if acknowledging the answer, but internally he was processing it, because in his world, answers were layered, complex, strategic. That one wasn't. And yet, it felt more complete than most answers he heard. "Is that why you're here?" he asked. Maria smiled slightly. "I'm here because if I wasn't, this event would fall apart." Mark glanced around, then back at her. "That sounds like confidence. That sounds like experience," she corrected. A small pause. Then she added, "And responsibility." That word held his attention. Because responsibility, he understood, but not in the way she meant it. "You take that seriously," he said. "I have to," she replied. "No one else is going to do it for me." There was no complaint in her voice, no frustration, just fact. And for a moment, Mark didn't respond, because something about that statement didn't fit into the frameworks he was used to. "Must be exhausting," he said finally. Maria shook her head. "No," she said. "Exhausting is pretending to be something you're not." That answer didn't just hold his attention, it challenged it, because Mark had built a life where perception mattered, where presentation mattered, where control over how things looked was part of how things worked. And Maria didn't operate that way. "Do you think that's what I'm doing?" he asked. She didn't rush to answer, didn't react defensively, didn't soften her words. "I think," she said slowly, "you're used to being in environments where everything has to look a certain way." Mark remained still, listening. "And I think," she continued, "you've gotten so good at managing that you don't even notice it anymore." Silence settled between them. Not tense, not uncomfortable, just honest. Because she wasn't attacking him. She was observing him, and she wasn't wrong. Mark exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition. "That's a very specific observation," he said. Maria smiled slightly. "You're not as hard to read as you think." That was new. Mark wasn't used to being read. Not accurately, not without effort. Most people saw what he allowed them to see, what he presented, what he controlled. Maria saw past that, without trying, and instead of resisting it, he leaned into it. "So what else do you see?" he asked. She hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding whether to give it. "Then, you're not as detached as you pretend to be," she said. The words landed quietly, but firmly. Mark didn't respond immediately, because that answer reached somewhere deeper than he expected. "I don't pretend," he said. Maria raised an eyebrow slightly. "Everyone pretends," she said. "Some people are just better at it." There was no challenge in her tone, no pressure, just perspective. And that was what made it difficult to dismiss. For the first time in a long time, Mark wasn't leading the conversation. He wasn't controlling it. He wasn't directing where it went. He was in it, and he didn't step away. The conversation continued, not in a straight line, but in moments. Questions, observations, silences that didn't need to be filled. They talked about small things, then bigger ones, then things that didn't usually come up in first conversations. Maria spoke about growing up surrounded by people who showed up for each other without needing reasons. Mark spoke about building something from nothing, and the discipline it required. She talked about connection. He talked about structure. They didn't agree on everything, but they didn't need to, because the difference was what made the conversation hold. At one point, Maria laughed at something he said, not politely, not lightly, but genuinely. And Mark paused, because that sound wasn't calculated, wasn't measured, wasn't controlled. It was real, and he realized something in that moment. He hadn't heard that kind of laughter around him in a long time, not because it didn't exist, but because his world didn't leave much room for it. "You're thinking again," Maria said. Mark looked at her. "I do that," he replied. "I noticed," she said. Another pause. "Then you don't always have to." That statement stayed, because for Mark, thinking was how he stayed ahead, how he stayed in control, how he avoided mistakes. But Maria was offering something different. Not control, not strategy, presence. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he didn't reject it. The event continued around them. Time passed. People came and went, but neither of them rushed to end the conversation, because something had already started. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real. Two people from completely different worlds, standing in the same space, not adjusting, not changing, just connecting. And neither of them said it out loud, but both of them felt it. This wasn't supposed to work, and that was exactly why it did. That connection didn't fade after the event. It didn't stay behind in that room. It followed them, quietly, naturally, without needing definition. Mark didn't ask for her number immediately. That wasn't how he operated, and Maria didn't offer it either. That wasn't how she moved. But before the night ended, they found each other again, near the exit, as people began to leave. "You stayed longer than you planned," Maria said, noticing him before he spoke. Mark gave a slight nod. "I did." She crossed her arms lightly, studying him, and he held her gaze. And it wasn't a waste of time. A small smile appeared on her face, not because she expected the compliment, but because it felt earned. "Careful," she said. "You're starting to sound like you enjoyed yourself." Mark almost smiled. "Let's not get carried away." That moment could have ended there. Another brief exchange, another interaction left unfinished. But this time, it didn't. "Do you always analyze everything this much?" Maria asked. "Yes," Mark replied. She nodded once. "Sounds exhausting." "It's effective." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "For not making mistakes." Maria didn't respond immediately. Then, "Sometimes the best things happen when you do." That statement stayed between them, not challenged, not dismissed, just accepted. "Are you always this sure of things?" Mark asked. Maria shook her head. "No," she said. "I just don't overthink the ones that feel right." A pause. "Then, like this?" Mark asked it, without hesitation. Maria held his gaze, and for the first time, there was a shift, not uncertainty, but awareness. "Yes," she said. That answer changed the direction of everything, because from that point on, they didn't pretend this was casual. They started seeing each other, not in a structured way, not with rules, not with expectations laid out, but consistently. The first time Mark entered Maria's world, he noticed everything, not because he was judging it, but because it was unfamiliar. The space was alive, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that didn't follow strict order. Music played in the background, not carefully selected, just present. Voices overlapped. People moved freely. There was no clear boundary between conversations, no defined beginning or end. And Maria fit into it effortlessly. She introduced him to people without formalities, no titles, no explanations. "This is Mark," she said simply, and that was enough. No one asked what he did. No one treated him differently. No one adjusted themselves to impress him. At first, Mark didn't know how to respond to that, because in his world, people adjusted immediately. But here, he wasn't the center of attention, and strangely, that didn't bother him. It grounded him. At one point, Maria handed him a plate. "You're not just going to stand there all night," she said. Mark looked at it, then at her. "I wasn't planning to eat." "You are now." There was no negotiation in her tone. He took the plate, not because he had to, but because saying no didn't feel necessary. Relax, she added. Nothing here requires a strategy. Mark let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. That's new, he said. I know, she replied. And for the first time, Mark allowed himself to exist in a space without controlling it. Not fully, but enough. And he noticed something. He wasn't uncomfortable. He was present. That realization stayed with him, because presence was not something he practiced. Meanwhile, Maria stepped into his world, and the difference was immediate. The environment was quiet, structured, every detail intentional. The lighting, the seating, the spacing between conversations, everything had a purpose. Maria walked beside him, taking it in, not intimidated, not impressed, just observing. You live like this all the time? She asked. Yes, Mark replied. She nodded slowly. It's calm. There was a slight pause before she added, but also controlled. Mark glanced at her. That's the point. Maria didn't argue, didn't challenge. She simply said, I can see that. They sat across from each other. Dinner placed perfectly. Everything arranged. Everything precise. And yet, something was different. Because Maria didn't adjust herself to the environment. She didn't lower her voice unnecessarily. Didn't change how she spoke. Didn't fit into the structure. She stayed herself. And instead of disrupting the space, she changed how it felt. So, she said, leaning back slightly, do you ever get tired of everything being this organized? Mark didn't hesitate. No. Maria smiled slightly. I figured. Then she leaned forward. But do you ever wonder what it feels like not to control everything? Mark met her gaze. I don't need to wonder. Why not? Because control prevents problems. Maria held his gaze. Or it prevents experiences. That landed differently, because it wasn't a disagreement. It was a possibility, and Mark didn't dismiss it. Their worlds didn't merge. They collided. But instead of pulling away, they leaned into it. Mark started stepping into spaces he wouldn't normally choose. Maria started sitting in environments she wouldn't normally stay in. Neither of them became the other, but both of them adjusted, and that adjustment created something neither of them expected. Excitement. Not the loud kind, not the overwhelming kind, but the kind that comes from discovering something new in someone else and in yourself. Because for Mark, Maria introduced unpredictability. And for Maria, Mark introduced stability. And for a while, that balance worked. Not perfectly, but naturally. And neither of them stopped to ask if it would last. For a while, it felt like balance. Not perfect, but manageable. Mark didn't try to change Maria. Maria didn't try to reshape Mark. They moved around each other, adjusted without forcing it, met in the middle when they could, and in private. That was enough. But life doesn't stay private. It expands. It introduces other people, other opinions, other expectations. And slowly, those outside voices began to matter. It started in Mark's world, not loudly, not directly, but clearly. Conversations shifted, not in front of him, but around him. Questions that didn't sound like questions. Comments that didn't sound like criticism. Who is she? That one came more than once. Always casually. Always followed by something neutral. She's different. That one carried more weight. Not necessarily negative, but not approving either. Mark heard it. Of course he did. He heard everything. But he didn't respond. Not at first. Because from his perspective, it didn't matter. Maria wasn't part of that world. Not officially, not structurally. She existed outside of it, and for a time, that separation protected them until it didn't. The first time Maria stepped fully into Mark's professional environment, the shift was immediate. She noticed it before he said anything, before anyone else spoke. The way conversations paused slightly when she approached, the way eyes lingered just a second too long, the way people assessed her, not openly, but deliberately. Maria didn't react outwardly. She had been in rooms like this before. Different context, same energy. But this time, it was personal, because she wasn't just entering a space. She was entering his space. Do they always look at people like that? She asked quietly as they stood near one side of the room. Mark glanced at her, then around. They're evaluating, he said. Maria nodded once. I figured. A pause. Then she added, They don't see me. Mark didn't respond immediately, because she was right. They see what they understand, he said. Maria looked at him. And what do they understand? Mark held her gaze. Not you. That answer wasn't comforting, but it was honest, and Maria preferred honesty. Still, something shifted in that moment, not between them, but around them, because now, the difference wasn't just something they experienced, it was something others saw and reacted to. Later that evening, a conversation reached Mark directly, not aggressive, not confrontational, just clear. This isn't your usual choice. Mark didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. She doesn't fit into this world. The voice continued. Mark's expression didn't change. She doesn't need to, he replied. There was a brief pause. That's not how things work, came the response. Mark didn't argue, but internally, he registered it. Because statements like that didn't come without expectation, and expectations always came with pressure. Meanwhile, Maria faced her own version of it, not in quiet rooms, not behind controlled conversations, but openly, directly. You trust him? That question came without hesitation. Maria didn't react immediately. I do, she said. A short pause. Why? She leaned back slightly, thinking. Because he doesn't pretend, she said. That's not enough, came the reply. Maria's expression didn't change. It is for me. Another pause. Then, he's not from here. Maria nodded. I know. He doesn't understand how things work. She held their gaze. Neither do I sometimes, she said. That answer didn't convince anyone, but it wasn't meant to, because Maria wasn't trying to justify anything. She was choosing it. Still, doubt didn't stay outside. It followed her, not loudly, not constantly, but enough. Enough to make her pause sometimes. Enough to make her think twice. Not about Mark, but about the gap between their lives, and whether that gap would stay manageable or grow. Back in Mark's world, the pressure became more direct, not aggressive, but persistent. You need to be careful. That one came during a quiet moment. Careful of what? Mark asked. Complications. Mark didn't respond immediately, because he understood what they meant, not just socially, not just personally, but structurally. Maria didn't fit into the systems he operated in, and systems didn't adjust easily. Still, he didn't step back, because stepping back would mean admitting something he didn't believe, that what they had was a mistake, and he didn't see it that way. Not yet. But pressure doesn't need agreement to exist. It builds quietly, and over time, it changes how things feel, not all at once, but in small moments, in conversations that carry more weight than before, in silences that last a little longer, in thoughts that weren't there at the beginning. One evening, Maria sat across from Mark, the space between them calm, but not as light as before. You hear them, don't you? She asked. Mark didn't pretend not to understand. Yes, he said. She nodded. They don't think this works. Mark leaned back slightly. That doesn't matter. Maria studied him. It might. That word didn't come from doubt. It came from awareness. Mark didn't respond immediately, because this time, it wasn't just about ignoring outside voices. It was about what those voices represented. Reality, structure, difference, and whether those things could stay separate from what they were building. Do you think it matters? Mark asked. Maria held his gaze. I think, she said slowly, that what we have is real. A pause. But real doesn't always mean easy. That shifted something, because until now, they had been moving forward without questioning the difficulty. Now, it had a name, and once something is named, it's harder to ignore. Let me ask you something. Do you think love is enough when two worlds don't match? Be honest. Drop your answer in the comments. Because this right here, this moment, is where everything starts to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. Because pressure doesn't break things immediately. It tests them first. And what Mark and Maria had was about to be tested. Pressure didn't break them. Not immediately. If anything, it pushed them closer. Because when two people feel something real, and the world around them starts questioning it, there's a natural instinct to hold on tighter, not out of fear, but out of certainty. Mark didn't pull away. Maria didn't step back. Instead, they chose each other more clearly, more intentionally, and that choice moved things faster than it should have. It wasn't planned, not in a structured way. There was no timeline, no checklist, no careful evaluation of long-term compatibility. There was just momentum and feeling and belief. "You're thinking again," Maria said one evening, watching Mark as he stood near the window. "I do that," he replied. "I know," she said, smiling slightly, "which is why I'm going to ask you something before you overthink it." Mark turned to face her. "What is it?" Maria held his gaze. No hesitation, no build-up. "What are we doing?" The question didn't come from uncertainty. It came from clarity. Mark didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because he was choosing how to say it. "We're building something," he said. Maria nodded once. "I know that." A pause. "But where is it going?" That question required more than observation. It required a decision. Mark stepped closer, not rushed, not hesitant. "Forward," he said. Maria studied him. "That's not specific." Mark didn't look away. "It doesn't need to be complicated," he said. She crossed her arms lightly. "Simple doesn't always mean clear." Another pause. "Then, what do you want, Mark?" This time, he didn't think. "You?" he said. The answer was immediate. And for a moment, everything else faded, because that wasn't strategy. That wasn't logic. That was choice. Maria held his gaze. "And you're sure about that?" "Yes." No hesitation. And that was enough, because Maria didn't need perfection. She needed certainty. And in that moment, she had it. Things changed after that. Not gradually, not subtly, but quickly. They spent more time together. Not occasionally, not when convenient, consistently. Days turned into nights. Nights turned into routines. Mark adjusted his schedule. Not entirely, but enough. Maria made space in her life. Not carefully, but naturally. And somewhere in that shift, a decision formed, not discussed over time, not analyzed from every angle, just decided we should get married. Mark said it calmly, as if it was the next logical step. Maria looked at him, not shocked, not overwhelmed, just focused. "You don't think that's fast?" she asked. Mark held her gaze. "I think it's right." Maria didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't a small decision. It wasn't just about how they felt. It was about everything around them, the differences, the pressure, the expectations, all of it. But then she thought about something else, how she felt when she was with him, how real it had been, how consistent, and how neither of them had pretended. "Say it again," she said. Mark didn't hesitate. "We should get married." This time, she smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. "Okay?" she said. And just like that, everything moved forward. The wedding wasn't extravagant, not in the way people expected from Mark. It wasn't about display. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about them. And for a moment, it worked, not just externally, but internally. They were happy, not in a loud way, not in a perfect way, but in a way that felt real. Mornings felt lighter. Conversations felt easier. There was comfort. There was laughter. There was a sense of building something together, instead of just experiencing it. And for a while, that was enough. But underneath that, something else existed. Not obvious, not immediate, but present, because the same things that brought them together were still different. Mark still preferred structure. Maria still moved with freedom. Mark planned ahead. Maria adapted in the moment. At first, those differences felt balanced. Now, they started to show, in small ways. One morning, Maria sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, relaxed. Mark walked in, already dressed, already focused. "We have a dinner tonight," he said. Maria looked up. "Tonight?" "Yes." She frowned slightly. "You didn't mention that." "It was confirmed yesterday." Maria leaned back. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Mark paused. "I assumed it wouldn't be an issue." Maria held his gaze. "That's not the point." A small silence followed, because this wasn't about dinner. It was about communication, about expectation, about assumption. "Then what is the point?" Mark asked. Maria exhaled lightly. "The point is, I don't want to feel like I'm fitting into your schedule." Mark's expression remained steady. "You're not," he said. Maria tilted her head slightly. It feels like it sometimes. That was the first real shift. Not an argument, not a conflict, but a difference that didn't resolve immediately. And moments like that started happening more often. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Small misunderstandings, small expectations not aligned. Nothing big enough to break anything, but enough to change the tone. Because now, they weren't just learning each other. They were living with each other. And living reveals things that moments don't. Still, they didn't step back. They moved forward because what they had still mattered. And neither of them was ready to question it fully. But something had changed. Not in what they felt, but in how they functioned. And that difference was only beginning. The shift didn't happen all at once. It built quietly. At first it looked like normal adjustment. Two people learning how to share space. But over time, those small moments from before stopped feeling small. They started to carry weight, not because they were bigger, but because they didn't go away. One morning, Maria stood in the kitchen, leaning slightly against the counter, her phone resting beside her. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't planning. She was just there. Mark walked in, already focused, already moving with purpose. "I scheduled something for tomorrow," he said, without looking up. Maria glanced at him. "Tomorrow?" "Yes." She waited. "For what?" she asked. Mark picked up his glass, taking a quick sip. "A dinner." Maria stared at him for a second. "Another one?" Mark looked at her briefly. "It's important." Maria nodded slowly. "Everything is important to you." There was no sarcasm, just observation. Mark didn't respond immediately. "Because it matters," he said. Maria pushed herself off the counter, slightly. "I'm not saying it doesn't," she replied. A pause. "I'm saying it's always something." Mark placed the glass down. "That's how things work." Maria shook her head. "No," she said. "That's how your world works." Her room fell quiet. Not tense, not explosive, but heavy. Because now, they weren't talking about schedules. They were talking about how they lived. Mark crossed his arms slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked. Maria met his gaze. "It means I don't want every part of my life planned in advance," she said. Mark frowned slightly. "It's not about planning everything." Maria didn't interrupt. "It's about being prepared," he continued. "For what?" she asked. "For what comes next." Maria tilted her head slightly. "And what if I don't always want to know what comes next?" That question didn't fit into Mark's way of thinking. "You should," he said. Maria let out a quiet breath. "See, that's the difference," she said. Mark's expression tightened slightly. "What difference?" Maria stepped closer. "You think everything has to be controlled to work," she said. Mark didn't deny it. "And you don't?" he asked. Maria shook her head. "I think some things work because you let them breathe." That didn't align with him. "Things fall apart when you don't manage them," Mark said. Maria held his gaze. "Or maybe they fall apart because you don't let them grow naturally." Silence. Because neither of them was wrong, but neither of them was willing to shift. And that was where the problem lived. The conversation ended there. Not resolved, not finished, just paused. And moments like that started happening more often. Not dramatic arguments, not loud disagreements, but constant friction, small things, a missed conversation, an assumption made too quickly, a reaction that didn't match expectation. One evening, Maria sat on the couch, her attention on something simple. Mark walked in, his phone still in his hand. "We need to talk about next week," he said. Maria didn't look up immediately. "About what?" she asked. "Our schedule." She finally looked at him. "Our schedule?" "Yes." Maria sat up slightly. "Since when do we have a schedule?" she asked. Mark exhaled quietly. "Since things started overlapping." Maria studied him. "Or since you decided they should," she replied. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. "This isn't about control," he said. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it about?" "Structure." Maria leaned back again. "You keep saying that, like it's the same thing." "It's not," Mark replied. Maria held his gaze. "It feels like it." That word, felt. Mark noticed it. "You're making this emotional," he said. Maria's expression changed slightly. "Because it is," she replied. Mark shook his head slightly. "No, it's practical." Maria sat up fully now. "Everything isn't practical, Mark. His tone stayed steady. It should be. Maria stared at him. For you, she said. Another pause. Because now, they weren't just disagreeing. They were defining themselves. And those definitions didn't match. I don't need everything to be controlled to feel secure, Maria said. Mark didn't respond immediately. I do, he said. That was the truth. And once it was said, it couldn't be softened. Maria nodded slowly. I know, she said. But there was something different in her voice now. Not frustration, realization. Because now, she wasn't trying to change him. She was understanding him. And understanding doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it brings clarity. And clarity can be harder to ignore than conflict. From that point on, things didn't break. But they didn't feel the same either. The laughter was still there, but less frequent. The conversation still happened, but with more pauses. And the space between them, even when they were in the same room, started to feel noticeable, not distant, but not as close. And that difference didn't come from one big moment. It came from all the small ones that never fully settled. The tension didn't explode. It settled, not in a way that brought peace, but in a way that made everything feel heavier. After that last conversation, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no slammed doors, just distance. Not physical. They were still in the same space, still sharing the same routines, still moving through the same days. But something underneath had shifted. Maria noticed it first, not because it was obvious, but because she felt it. The pauses in conversation, the way responses came a second too late, the way things that used to feel natural now felt considered. Mark noticed it too, but he approached it differently. To him, nothing was broken. Things were just misaligned. And misalignment could be fixed. That was how he saw it. So he adjusted, not emotionally, practically. He tried to be more aware of schedules, more intentional with communication, more structured in how they interacted. And without realizing it, that made it worse. Because what Maria needed wasn't adjustment. It was connection. And connection doesn't respond to structure. One evening, they sat across from each other, dinner between them, untouched. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar. And that was the problem. Maria looked at him, really looked at him. You've been different, she said. Mark didn't react immediately. I've been trying, he replied. Maria nodded slightly. I can see that. A pause, but it doesn't feel better. Mark frowned slightly. What do you mean? Maria leaned back. I mean, it feels like you're managing us. Mark's expression tightened. I'm trying to make things work. Maria held his gaze. That's not the same thing. Silence. Because that difference wasn't something he naturally understood. What would you prefer I do? Mark asked. Maria didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't simple. I don't want to feel like I'm part of a system, she said finally. Mark exhaled quietly. You're not. Maria shook her head. That's how it feels. Mark leaned forward slightly. Then explain it to me. That was genuine. But it also revealed something else he didn't already understand. Maria looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression changed. Not anger, not frustration, something deeper. You don't see it, she said quietly. Mark held her gaze. Then help me see it. Maria inhaled slowly, because now, this wasn't just about behavior. This was about identity, about being known, and whether that had ever truly happened. You listen to respond, she said. Mark didn't interrupt. You solve things before you understand them, she continued. His expression remained steady. And you think that's helping, she added. Mark spoke carefully. I'm trying to fix what's not working. Maria nodded once. I know. A pause. But I don't always need things to be fixed. That didn't fit into his thinking. Then what do you need? He asked. Maria looked at him. I need you to understand me. Mark didn't hesitate. I do. Maria's expression didn't change. No, she said softly. You don't. Silence filled the space, because that statement wasn't loud, but it was final. Mark leaned back slightly. That's not fair, he said. Maria didn't raise her voice. I'm not trying to be fair, she replied. Another pause. I'm trying to be honest. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. I've been here, he said. I've shown up. Maria nodded. I know. Then what's missing? He asked. That question was the moment everything turned, because Maria didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her eyes, no uncertainty, just truth. Do you even know who I am outside of this marriage? The question landed and stayed. Mark didn't respond, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't have an answer, not a real one, not one that went beyond what he had seen, beyond what he had experienced with her, beyond how she fit into his life. And that realization hit him in the moment he tried to speak, because nothing came out. Maria watched him, not waiting, not expecting, just observing, and the silence said everything. Because silence, when a question like that is asked, isn't neutral. It's an answer. Maria nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because now she had clarity, not about him, but about them. You see me when I'm with you, she said quietly. Mark didn't interrupt. But you don't see me beyond that, she continued. His expression remained steady. And I need more than that, she added. The words weren't harsh. They were measured, but they carried weight, because they weren't about a moment. They were about everything. Mark finally spoke. I can learn, he said. Maria looked at him. I know you can, she replied. A pause. But I don't know if you will. That was the difference. Not ability, willingness. And that question didn't have an immediate answer. The room felt quieter, not because the sound had changed, but because everything between them had. I don't want to lose this, Mark said. Maria held his gaze. Neither do I. Another pause. But I don't want to lose myself either. That line drew the boundary clear, unavoidable. And for the first time, Mark didn't try to respond, because this wasn't something he could solve. Not quickly, not logically, not the way he was used to. And Maria didn't push further, because she had already said what needed to be said. The conversation ended there, not resolved, not repaired, but changed, because now everything was out in the open, and once something is seen clearly, it can't be unseen. After that conversation, nothing exploded. There was no dramatic fallout, no raised voices echoing through the house, no doors slammed in anger, just quiet, but not the peaceful kind, the kind that settles in when everything important has already been said, and there's nothing left to argue about. Maria didn't bring it up again, not because it didn't matter, but because it had already been answered, not with words, but with silence. Mark didn't try to revisit it immediately, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how. For the first time, he was facing something he couldn't organize, solve, or structure into clarity, and that hesitation created space, not intentional, not planned, but real. Days passed. They still shared the same home, still moved through the same routines, but something had changed in how those routines felt. Maria became quieter, not distant, not cold, just inward. She still spoke, still responded, still engaged, but there was a layer missing. The openness, the ease, the version of her that filled spaces without thinking. Mark noticed, of course he did, but instead of asking directly, he observed, trying to understand, trying to find a pattern, trying to figure out what needed to be fixed. And that approach was exactly what Maria had been trying to explain. One evening, they sat in the same room, not together, but not apart either. Maria was on one side, Mark on the other. The television was on, but neither of them was watching it. Are we going to talk about this? Mark asked finally. Maria didn't look at him immediately. We already did, she said. Mark leaned forward slightly. That wasn't a conversation, he replied. Maria turned her head just enough to look at him. It was for me. The calm in her voice wasn't reassuring. It was final. Mark paused. I don't want this to end because of something I can fix, he said. Maria held his gaze. It's not about fixing, she replied. Then what is it about? He asked. Maria took a breath. It's about feeling like I exist in this relationship, she said. Mark frowned slightly. You do? Maria shook her head. No, she said. I exist in your life. A pause. But that's not the same thing. Mark didn't respond immediately, because that distinction wasn't something he had considered before. I've been here, he said again. Maria nodded. I know. And I've tried, he added. I know that too. Another pause. Then why does it feel like I'm losing you? Mark asked. Maria didn't hesitate. Because you never really had me the way I needed to be had. The words weren't loud, but they were clear, and they landed. Mark leaned back slightly, trying to process something that didn't fit into his usual way of understanding. What does that even mean? He asked. Maria looked at him. It means you loved me in a way that made sense to you, she said. A pause, but not in a way that made me feel seen. Silence filled the room, because that wasn't something he could argue with, not without denying her experience, and he didn't want to do that. I can change that, Mark said. Maria's expression softened slightly. I believe you think that, she replied. A small pause. But I don't think you understand what that change requires. Mark held her gaze. Then help me understand. Maria looked at him for a long moment. And then she shook her head. I don't think I should have to teach you how to see me, she said. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but decisive. Because now, the question wasn't whether they cared. It was whether they could meet each other where it mattered. And the answer wasn't clear enough. Days turned into weeks. The conversations became shorter, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them knew how to say what was missing. Eventually, the word came up, not in anger, not in frustration, but in acceptance. Maybe we should take some time, Maria said one afternoon. Mark looked at her. Time for what? He asked. Maria held his gaze. To figure out if this is something we're holding on to, or something we're forcing. Mark didn't answer immediately, because he already knew what that meant. And for the first time, E didn't try to redirect it. Is that what you want? He asked. Maria paused. Then, yes. That answer didn't come easily, but it came honestly. And that was what made it final. The process wasn't messy. No public conflict. No drawn-out arguments. Just conversations, quiet, direct, and difficult. They talked about logistics, about timing, about what came next, not emotionally, practically, because once a decision like that is made, emotion steps back and reality steps in. The divorce was handled the same way, efficient, clean, no drama, no scenes, just signatures and space. Mark stood in the house after everything was finalized. The same house, the same rooms, the same structure, but something was missing. Not visibly, but undeniably. The absence wasn't loud, but it was constant. Maria, on the other hand, didn't return to that space. She moved back into an environment that felt familiar, not easier, but more aligned with who she was. Surrounded by people who didn't need explanation. Spaces that didn't require adjustment. A life that felt like hers again. Mark stayed where he was, but he didn't stay the same. He worked more longer hours, more focused, more structured, because work was something he understood, something he could control, something that didn't ask him questions he couldn't answer. Maria moved differently. She didn't rush into anything, didn't try to replace what had ended. She simply lived, day by day, finding herself again, not as someone's wife, but as herself. And just like that, their lives separated, not with chaos, not with anger, but with clarity. They walked away from each other, not because they didn't care, but because what they had wasn't enough to hold them together, and both of them knew it, even if they didn't say it out loud. The silence after the divorce didn't feel the same as before. This time, it wasn't shared. It belonged to each of them separately. Maria felt it first, not as loneliness, not as regret, but as space, real space, the kind that allows you to hear your own thoughts again. She moved back into a life that felt familiar, not identical to before, but close enough to feel like herself again. Her days didn't follow strict schedules. I moved naturally. Conversations stretched when they needed to. Silence existed without pressure, and for a while, that felt right. Not easy, but right. Because even though the marriage had ended quietly, it had still taken something from her. Time, energy, emotion. And now, she was rebuilding, not from nothing, but from experience. She didn't rush into anything, didn't try to fill the space with distractions. She let it exist, and slowly, she started to feel like herself again, until something changed. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just small signs. a shift in how she felt physically, a sense that something was different. At first, she ignored it, not out of denial, but because she had just regained control of her life, and she wasn't ready for anything unexpected. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed quiet, persistent, until she couldn't ignore it anymore. The moment she realized wasn't loud. There was no immediate reaction, no panic, no rush, just stillness. Because the confirmation didn't bring confusion. It brought clarity. Maria was pregnant. She sat with that truth, not for minutes, not for hours, but for days. Because this wasn't just news. It was a decision waiting to be made. Not about whether to keep the child. That part came naturally. She didn't question it, didn't hesitate. That choice was immediate. But everything else wasn't. Because there was someone else connected to that decision, Mark. And the thought of him didn't bring anger. It didn't bring resentment. It brought something more complicated. Understanding. Maria knew who he was, not just the man she had married, but the way he lived, the way he thought, the way he structured everything around control. And she knew something else too. Their marriage hadn't ended by accident. It ended because something fundamental didn't align. And bringing a child into that wouldn't erase those differences. It might make them worse. She thought about telling him more than once. Not impulsively, carefully. She imagined the conversation, how he would react, what he would say, what he would do next. And every time, she reached the same point. Not certainty, but concern. Not for herself, for the child. Because Mark wouldn't ignore something like this. He wouldn't stay distant. He would step in, take responsibility, structure everything. And that was exactly what made her hesitate. Because responsibility, in his world, came with control, and control is what she had just walked away from. She sat alone one evening, thinking through it again. If I tell him, she said quietly to herself. The sentence didn't finish because she already knew what came next. Things would change, not slowly, immediately. Decisions would be made, plans would be created, expectations would follow, and the life she had just rebuilt would no longer be hers alone. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape the thought, but to face it fully. Is that what I want? She asked herself. The answer didn't come quickly, because this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about consequence, and consequence doesn't always come with clear direction. She thought about the child, not as an idea, but as a future, a life shaped by the environment it grows in. And she asked herself something simple. What kind of life do I want this child to have? The answer came clearer than anything else. Freedom. Not absence of structure, but space. Room to grow without pressure. Room to exist without constant expectation. Room to be real. And when she thought about that, she realized something. That life didn't match Mark's world. Lot the way it was, not the way he lived. And that realization made the decision clearer. Not easy, but clear. She wasn't going to tell him. Not now. Not while everything was still uncertain. Not while she was still finding her footing again. This wasn't about keeping something from him. It was about protecting something she didn't fully understand yet, and protecting herself. Because stepping back into his world, even for the right reasons, would mean stepping back into everything she had just left behind. And she wasn't ready for that. Maria placed her hand gently against her stomach. Not out of instinct, but awareness, because now everything was different. Not visibly, but completely. I'll figure it out, she said quietly. And for the first time since the divorce, her path forward wasn't just about her. It was about someone else. Someone who hadn't even entered the world yet, but had already changed everything. Let me ask you something. Was she right to keep this secret, or should she have told him immediately? I need your honest opinion. Drop it in the comments. Because this decision, right here, is going to shape everything that comes next. Maria didn't announce the change in her life. She didn't gather attention around it. She carried it quietly, not because she was hiding, but because she was adjusting. Pregnancy didn't slow her down. Immediately, she continued her routine, moved through her days the same way she always had. But internally, everything felt different. Her awareness shifted. Every decision carried more weight. Every choice felt connected to something beyond herself. And that realization changed how she moved. Not dramatically, but intentionally. There were moments of exhaustion she hadn't expected, moments where her body asked her to stop, even when her mind wanted to keep going. At first, that frustrated her because she wasn't used to slowing down. But over time, she adapted, not by resisting it, but by listening. And that was the first shift. She wasn't just living for herself anymore. She was preparing. Months passed, not quickly, but steadily. Each day adding something new, a new awareness, a new responsibility, a new connection. Maria didn't romanticize it. She didn't pretend it was easy. There were nights she sat alone, thinking about everything ahead, not with fear, but with seriousness, because raising a child alone wasn't something she took lightly. She thought about Mark sometimes, not constantly, but in specific moments, when she considered what the child might need, when she imagined questions that might come later. But every time, she returned to the same place. She would handle it, step by step, in her own terms. And when the child finally arrived, everything changed again. Not in a way that disrupted her, but in a way that deepened her. The first time she held the child, she didn't speak. She didn't need to, because that moment didn't require explanation. It required presence, and she gave it fully. Days turned into nights, nights into routines. Sleep became inconsistent. Time became fluid. Her life adjusted completely around the child, not forced. Naturally, she learned quickly how to respond, how to adapt, how to keep going, even when she was tired. And through it all, she didn't reach out, not once, because the decision she made stayed, not out of stubbornness, but out of consistency. She wasn't waiting for the right time. She was building a life. And in that life, she found strength she hadn't needed before. Not loud strength, not visible, but steady. The kind that holds everything together without needing recognition. As the child grew, Maria noticed things, not immediately, but gradually. Small behaviors, small patterns. At first, they didn't mean anything, just observations. The way the child watched people, not reacting immediately, studying, taking time before responding. That stood out, because most children moved quickly, reacted freely. But this child paused, just like Mark did. Maria noticed it one afternoon. They were in a crowded space. Other children moved around freely, playing, talking, laughing. But her child stood slightly apart, not isolated, just aware, watching everything. Maria crouched down beside them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. The child looked at her, then back at the room. "Just looking," came the response, simple but intentional. Maria felt something shift inside her, not concern, recognition, because that response wasn't random. It was familiar, and she knew exactly where it came from. There were other moments, too. Small habits. The way the child adjusted their position before speaking. The way they observed conversations before joining them. The way they stayed calm, even in busy environments. Each one subtle, but together they formed a pattern, and Maria saw it clearly. Mark, not in appearance, not in obvious ways, but in behavior, in presence, in how the child processed the world. And every time she noticed it, she paused, because those traits didn't come from her. They came from him. And for a moment, the decision she made felt heavier, not wrong, but more complex, because now it wasn't just about protecting the child from a world she didn't trust. It was about knowing that part of that world already lived inside them. Still, she didn't reach out, because nothing had changed about why she made the decision. Mark's world was still structured, still demanding, still built on control, and she wasn't ready to bring the child into that, not without certainty. So she continued, raising the child, teaching them, guiding them, creating a life that felt grounded, not perfect, but real. And as time moved forward, that life became stronger, not because it was easy, but because she committed to it completely. And through it all, she carried the one truth she never spoke out loud, that somewhere, without knowing, Mark had a child, growing, learning, becoming someone he had never met. While Maria was building something new, Mark was building more of what he already had. From the outside, nothing about his life suggested loss. If anything, It looked like progress. More deals, more expansion, more influence. His name carried even more weight than before. Rooms responded to him faster. Decisions moved around him quicker. Everything he had worked for continued to grow, and he matched it. Longer hours, less distraction, more focus, because work still made sense. It followed structure. It rewarded effort. It produced results. There were no unclear expectations, no emotional variables he couldn't calculate. It was simple, and that simplicity was exactly what he needed. At least, that's what he told himself. Because outside of work, something felt different. Not immediately. At first, the silence didn't bother him. The house was quiet, but it had always been that way. Controlled, organized. Now, it was just empty. Not physically. Everything was still in place, but something was missing. Not an object, a presence. And it showed up in moments he didn't expect. Walking into a room and realizing no one was there. Sitting down and having no conversation to respond to. Finishing a day and having nothing to shift his focus away from work. At first, he ignored it, because ignoring things had always worked. If something didn't serve a purpose, he didn't give it attention. But this didn't disappear. It stayed, not loudly, but consistently. And over time, it became harder to dismiss. Mark didn't talk about it, not to anyone, because there was nothing to explain. From the outside, everything was exactly as it should be. He had his work, his structure, his control, but internally, there was a gap, not dramatic, but noticeable, and the more time passed, the more defined it became. He thought about Maria sometimes, not constantly, but in specific moments, when something reminded him of a conversation, a reaction, a difference, not with regret, but with recognition, because now, without the tension of the relationship, he saw things differently, not clearly, but enough to notice what he hadn't before. Still, he didn't reach out, not because he couldn't, but because the decision had already been made. And in his world, decisions weren't revisited lightly. So time moved forward. Days became months. Months became years. And life continued. Maria built her life around the child. Mark built his life around his work. Two separate paths. No connection, no overlap. Until there was the event. It wasn't unusual for Mark. Another gathering. Another room filled with people expecting something from him. He attended the same way he always did. Present, controlled, aware. Nothing about the night suggested anything different. Until it did. Because in the middle of everything, his attention shifted. Not intentionally, naturally, toward something he didn't expect. A child, standing slightly apart from the movement around them. Still, observing, not reacting, watching. Mark noticed immediately, not because the child stood out loudly, but because of how they existed in the space. Calm, measured, aware, and something about that felt familiar. He didn't move closer. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, the same way he always did when something didn't immediately make sense. And the more he observed, the stronger that feeling became. Not recognition, not yet, but connection, the kind that forms before logic catches up. The child adjusted their stance slightly, subtle but precise. Mark felt it again, because that movement wasn't random. It was intentional, and he knew that pattern. Without knowing why, he remained still, focused, trying to understand what exactly he was seeing. And then the child turned slightly, and someone stepped into view. Maria. Everything aligned in that moment. Not gradually, immediately, because now the connection wasn't abstract. It was clear, not confirmed, but undeniable. Mark's gaze moved between them. The child, Maria, back again, and something settled inside him. Not confusion, not disbelief, but realization, because Maria didn't look surprised. She didn't react like someone caught off guard. She didn't move like someone trying to avoid a situation. She stood there, calm, as if this moment had already happened for her, as if she had already accepted everything that came with it. And that was what made it real, because now there was only one explanation that made sense, not proven, but clear, and it didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with weight, she knew. The thought formed naturally, not forced, not questioned, and the rest of it followed without hesitation. She knew. And she didn't tell me. Mark didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react outwardly, but internally, everything shifted. Because this wasn't just about the present. This was about years, time he hadn't known, moments he hadn't been part of, a life that had existed without him. And standing there, looking at both of them, he understood something clearly. The story he thought had ended had never actually been finished. Mark didn't move immediately. Not because he was unsure, but because moving too quickly would break the moment before he understood it. He stood where he was, watching, not just the child, Maria, because the answer he was trying to confirm wasn't going to come from observation alone. It was going to come from her. But before that, he needed to be certain of what he was seeing. The child shifted slightly, still calm, still aware, not distracted by the environment, not pulled by movement or noise, focused. And the more Mark watched, the more that feeling settled. Not doubt, recognition, not based on appearance, based on behavior, the way the child processed the room, the way they observed before reacting. It mirrored him, not learned, natural. And that was what made it impossible to ignore. Mark exhaled slowly, not to calm himself, but to steady the shift happening inside him. Because this wasn't something he could approach the way he approached everything else. This wasn't a situation. It was a truth. And truth didn't respond to control. It demanded clarity. Maria hadn't moved. She stood near the child, not protective, not guarded, just present, as if everything in this moment was already known to her. Mark stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, measured, each step deliberate, because now there was no reason to stay where he was. The distance between them closed slowly, not physically first, emotionally, because every step forward brought the past with it, the conversations, the differences, the ending, and now, Maria noticed him before he spoke. Of course she did. Her eyes shifted toward him, calm, the same calm he had seen from across the room. No tension, no surprise, just awareness. Mark stopped a few steps away, close enough, but not close enough to invade. They stood there, facing each other, years between them, reduced to a single moment. Mark, Maria said, her voice steady, not distant, not warm, balanced. Maria, he replied. The exchange was simple, but it carried everything that hadn't been said for years. A pause followed, not awkward, but full, because both of them understood. This wasn't just a reunion. This was a confrontation waiting to happen. Mark's gaze shifted briefly, toward the child, then back to her. Not obvious, but intentional. Maria noticed. Of course she did. You've been well, she said. It wasn't a question. Mark nodded once. Yes. A pause. And you? He asked. Maria held his gaze. Yes. The simplicity of the exchange didn't match what was happening underneath, because neither of them was addressing the obvious. And the longer that silence stayed, the heavier it became. Mark didn't look away this time. He allowed the question to form, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable. How long? He asked. Maria didn't react outwardly, but internally, the moment arrived, because that question didn't need explanation. It carried meaning. It carried recognition, and it carried the beginning of everything that had been left unsaid. She didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't understand, but because she was choosing how to respond. Mark held his position, not pressing, but not stepping back either. The child looked between them, not confused, just aware, watching the shift in tone, watching the change in energy. Maria glanced down briefly, then back at Mark. Long enough, she said. The answer didn't give details, but it confirmed everything. Mark nodded slowly, because he didn't need numbers. He understood what that meant. Years. Time that had passed without him. He looked at the child again, this time not as an observer, but as someone trying to understand something deeper. The connection wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, and standing in front of him. Why? He asked. The question came out quieter than expected, not accusatory, not demanding, just direct. Maria didn't look away. Because I didn't know if your world would make space for this, she said. Mark didn't interrupt, didn't respond immediately, because that answer wasn't defensive. It was honest. And honesty doesn't give you something to argue against. You decided that alone, he said. Maria nodded. Yes. A pause. I had to. Mark's expression didn't change, but something inside him did, because this wasn't just about a decision. It was about trust, and whether it had ever fully existed. You could have told me, he said. Maria held his gaze. I know. Another pause. But I also knew what would happen if I did. Mark didn't respond immediately, because part of him knew she was right. Not completely, but enough. I wouldn't have ignored it, he said. Maria nodded. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. Silence settled again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Not agreement, but recognition. Mark exhaled slowly, because now the situation wasn't unclear. It was defined. He looked at the child again, not briefly, fully, and something shifted in his expression. Not shock, not disbelief, but wait. Because now he wasn't just seeing a child. He was seeing time, years he hadn't been part of, moments he hadn't experienced, and none of that could be changed. Maria watched him, not closely, but attentively, because this moment wasn't just about him understanding. It was about how he would respond, and that was something she couldn't predict. The distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like space. It felt like history, and standing in it, neither of them could pretend this was simple, because it wasn't, and it wasn't over, not even close. The moment didn't escalate. It deepened. There were no raised voices, no sudden reactions, just stillness. The kind that forces truth to surface without distraction. Mark didn't look away, not from Maria, not from the weight of what had just been confirmed. The child remained nearby, quiet, observing, unaware of the full meaning of what was happening, but aware enough to feel the shift. Maria noticed that. She stepped slightly closer to the child, not protectively, just instinctively. Mark saw it, and for the first time since approaching, he adjusted, not stepping back, but softening his presence, because this wasn't just between him and Maria anymore. There was someone else in the middle of it, someone who didn't ask for any of this. Mark's voice came out steady. How old? He asked. Maria didn't hesitate. She gave him the answer. No delay, no avoidance. And that number didn't just give information. It defined everything. Time that had moved forward. Without him knowing, Mark nodded once, not reacting outwardly, but inside. Something shifted again, because now it wasn't abstract anymore. It was measurable, real. You never planned to tell me, he asked. Maria held his gaze. I thought about it, she said. A pause, more than once. Mark didn't interrupt, but every time I did, she continued, I came back to the same place. What place? He asked. Maria inhaled slowly. The one where everything we struggled with came back again. Mark's expression remained controlled. That doesn't justify keeping this from me, he said. Maria didn't react defensively. I didn't do it to justify anything, she replied. Then why? He asked. Maria looked at him fully. Because I didn't want to lose myself again, she said. The answer landed quietly, but it carried weight, because it wasn't about him being absent. It was about what his presence represented. Mark absorbed that, not immediately, but carefully. I wasn't trying to take anything from you, he said. Maria nodded. I know that. A pause, but that's what happened. Silence followed, because both statements were true. And truth doesn't cancel itself out just because it conflicts. Mark looked down briefly, then back at her. I would have been there, he said. Maria didn't challenge that. I know you would have, she replied. Then why decide for me? He asked. Her voice didn't change. Because I knew what that would look like. Mark frowned slightly. And what does that mean? He asked. Maria took a moment. It means you wouldn't have stepped in halfway, she said. A pause. You would have taken responsibility completely. Mark didn't deny it. And that's a problem? He asked. Maria held his gaze. It was, for me, the words were careful, not accusatory, but clear. Because responsibility in your world comes with structure, she continued. Mark remained still. And structure, she added, comes with control. That word stayed between them, because it had always been there, from the beginning. Mark didn't respond immediately, because now he wasn't just hearing her. He was understanding what she had been trying to say all along. You think I would have controlled everything, he said. Maria didn't hesitate. Yes, a pause. Not intentionally, she added, but consistently. Mark exhaled slowly, because part of him recognized that, not as accusation, as reality. I could have adjusted, he said. Maria looked at him. Maybe, she replied. A small pause. But I didn't want to take that risk with a child. That shifted everything. Because now, this wasn't just about their past. It was about a decision made for the future, and the weight of that decision couldn't be reduced. Mark looked at the child again, this time longer, taking in details, not just behavior, presence, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it fully, not anger, not resentment, loss, not dramatic, but heavy, because it wasn't about what had been done. It was about what had been missed, years, moments, experiences that had existed without him, and none of that could be recovered. Maria watched him carefully, because this was the moment she had anticipated. Not his reaction, but his realization, and she saw it in the way his expression shifted, in the way his focus changed, not outwardly, but internally. I missed everything, Mark said quietly. Maria didn't respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to soften, nothing to correct. Yes, she said. The word wasn't harsh, it was honest. Mark nodded once, accepting it, not because he agreed with how it happened, but because it was true. A long pause followed, not uncomfortable, but necessary, because both of them needed to sit with what had just been said. Finally, Mark spoke again. Does the child know? He asked. Maria shook her head. No. Mark processed that. And you weren't planning to tell them? He asked. Maria looked at him. I was, she said. A pause. But on my terms. Mark nodded slowly, because that was consistent with everything she had done. You made every decision alone, he said. Maria didn't deny it. Yes. Another pause. Because I had to, she added. Mark didn't respond immediately. Because now, blame didn't feel useful. Understanding did, even if it came late, even if it came after everything had already happened. The child shifted slightly again, looking between them, still quiet, still observant, and Mark noticed it again. That familiar presence, that calm awareness, and something inside him settled. Not acceptance, not fully, but direction. Because now, the situation wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. And for the first time since the conversation began, Mark's focus moved forward, not backward. Mark didn't rush his next words. For the first time, he didn't try to respond immediately, because everything that could have been said quickly didn't matter anymore. This wasn't a situation he could solve in a sentence. It wasn't something he could organize into a plan. It required something different, patience, something he hadn't relied on before. He looked at Maria, not with frustration, not with accusation, but with clarity. Can I be part of their life now? He asked. The question wasn't loud. It didn't carry pressure. It didn't demand anything. It was simple, and that was what made it different. Maria didn't answer right away, because this wasn't just a question. It was a turning point, not for him, for all of them. She studied him, not looking for emotion, looking for intention, because she had known him long enough to understand the difference. What does that look like to you? She asked. Mark didn't hesitate. It looks like showing up, he said. A pause, not taking over. Maria remained still. Not changing what you've built, he added. Another pause. Just being there. The words were measured, not perfect, but honest. Maria held his gaze, because this version of him wasn't the one she had left. There was no urgency in his tone, no need to control the outcome, just willingness. And if it doesn't happen the way you expect? She asked. Mark nodded slightly. Then I adjust. That answer would have sounded different before. Now, it felt real, because it didn't come from strategy. It came from understanding. Maria exhaled slowly, because this wasn't easy. Not because she didn't trust him, but because trust wasn't something that returned all at once. It had to be built again, step by step. You don't get to decide everything, she said. Mark didn't argue. I know. You don't get to step in and change things overnight. I won't. A pause. And this isn't about you catching up for lost time, she added. Mark held her gaze. I understand that. That was the difference. Not just hearing her, understanding her. Maria looked down briefly, then back at him. "This has to be consistent," she said. Mark nodded. "It will be." Another pause. "Not for a moment," she continued. "For real." Mark didn't hesitate. "I'm not here for a moment." The child stood nearby, watching, not fully aware of the conversation, but aware of the shift, the tone, the attention. Maria looked at the child, then back at Mark. And in that moment, the decision wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. "Okay," she said. The word was quiet, but it carried weight. Not agreement, without condition, but permission to begin, and that was enough. Mark didn't move immediately, because he understood something important. This wasn't the moment to step forward fully. It was the moment to respect space. So instead, he stayed where he was, present, available, without pressure. And over time, that approach mattered, because consistency showed more than words ever could. Mark didn't try to change routines. He didn't impose structure. He observed, learned, adjusted, the same way he had learned business. But this time, it wasn't about results. It was about connection. And connection couldn't be forced. There were moments that felt uncertain. Moments where the child watched him closely, not questioning, but studying, the same way Mark once studied the room. And instead of directing the interaction, Mark allowed it to happen naturally, answering when spoken to, listening more than he spoke. And slowly, the distance shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. Maria saw it, not just in the child, in Mark, because he didn't rush, didn't control, didn't push. He stayed consistent, and consistency was something she hadn't seen from him in this way before. They didn't go back to what they had before. That wasn't the goal, because what they had before hadn't worked. Instead, they built something new, not defined by expectations, but shaped by understanding. There were still differences, still moments where perspectives didn't align. But now, they approached those moments differently, not trying to win, trying to understand. And that changed everything. One evening, Maria stood beside Mark, watching the child. There was no tension, no uncertainty, just presence. "You've changed," she said quietly. Mark didn't look at her immediately. "I had to," he replied. Maria nodded. "Why?" Mark paused. "Then, because I saw what happens when I don't." That answer didn't need more explanation. Maria understood, not perfectly, but enough. And for the first time, there was something between them that hadn't been there before. Perspective, not based on assumption, but on experience. And that was what allowed things to move forward. Not quickly, not easily, but honestly. The story didn't return to what it was. It became something else, something better, because this time, it wasn't built on momentum. It was built on awareness, on patience, on understanding what they had learned from everything that had happened. And that made the difference. Because love, the second time, wasn't about feeling. It was about choice. And both of them chose differently. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me this: do you believe people can truly change? Because sometimes it's not about who someone was, it's about who they choose to become when it finally matters.